Pretend you don't know me. My son whispered it to me at his own wedding, at the door, before I'd even found my seat. Pretend you don't know me. His own father. And I did it. I sat in the very back row and pretended to be a stranger at my only son's wedding, right up until the bride started down the aisle, stopped halfway, turned, and walked straight to me. She wasn't supposed to do that. Nobody was supposed to notice the quiet old man in the back that my son had asked to disappear. But the bride, a young woman I had met exactly once, stopped 180 guests and a string quartet cold, walked the wrong way down her own aisle, and did the one thing that unraveled everything my son had spent 2 years building. And what she said when she reached me is the reason I'm telling you this instead of taking it to my grave. I'm Earl. I'm 71. I drove a delivery truck for 38 years. Bread, mostly, before dawn, to grocery stores that were still dark. It is not a glamorous life, and I never pretended it was. But it put my son Nathan through college, and then law school, and I was proud to do it, and I never once asked him for anything back, which is what makes what he whispered at that door so hard to say out loud, even now. Before I tell you why the bride turned around, I have to tell you what my son became, and how a boy I carried on my shoulders came to be ashamed of the shoulders. Stay with me. This one turns on a single sentence a stranger said that my own son couldn't. Let me go back. My son Nathan is 34, and I'll be fair to him because a cartoon teaches you nothing, and because he's my boy and I love him even now, even after. Nathan wasn't cruel. Nathan was ashamed. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole story. Somewhere on the road from that bread truck to the corner office, my son started to feel that where he came from was something that could be smelled on him, and that I, his father, in my one good suit that was 15 years out of style, was the smell. It didn't happen overnight. It came in inches, the way these things do. The first inch was small. He stopped bringing his new friends around the house. Then he stopped inviting me to things where those friends would be. Then, when he did see me, he started correcting me, how I talked, what I ordered. He bought me a nicer jacket one Christmas, and I understood, opening it, that it wasn't a gift, it was a costume, a request to look like someone he wouldn't have to explain. And I let him. That's the part I need the older folks watching to hear, because some of you are doing the same thing right now, and I want you to know, I understand it. I let him correct me and dress me and slowly push me to the edges of his life, because I told myself it was just a young man finding his footing in a bigger world, and that he'd circle back once he felt secure. Loneliness makes a man a very good liar to himself. I kept waiting for Nathan to circle back. He never did. He just kept climbing, and every rung up, I got a little smaller in his rearview mirror. I want to tell you about those years of getting smaller, because I think some of you are living inside them right now, and there is no lonelier feeling than being slowly erased by someone you'd die for, one polite correction at a time. There was the phone. Nathan used to call every Sunday. We'd talk 20 minutes, nothing important, the score of a game, the weather. Then the Sundays got shorter. Then they got to be every other Sunday. Then they became texts. Busy week, talk soon. And soon never quite came. I never called him out on it. I'd sit by the phone on a Sunday like an old dog by a door, and when it didn't ring, I'd tell myself he was building something, that a young man on the rise doesn't have time, that it wasn't personal. It was personal. I just couldn't afford to know it. There was the time I showed up to a dinner he'd mentioned, a work thing, a nice restaurant. I thought I'd surprise him, bring him the good cufflinks that had been my own father's. And I saw him through the window before I went in, at a table full of laughing people in clothes that cost more than my truck, and I watched him be so easy, so light, so unashamed. In that room, and I stood on the sidewalk with the cufflinks in my pocket, and I understood that if I walked in, the lightness would go out of him, that he would have to explain me. So I put the cufflinks back in my pocket, and I drove home, and I never told him I'd come. That was the night I first understood, all the way down, that my son was ashamed of me. And I forgave him for it before I'd even finished the drive home, because that is what you do, apparently, right up until it nearly costs you everything. And there were the small edits. He'd introduce me, on the rare occasions he had to, as, "My dad, he's retired." Never, "He drove a delivery truck for 38 years, as if the work itself were the shameful part. He'd steer me away from his friends' questions about what I used to do. He curated me down to a safe, blank, retired nobody, sanded the bread truck right off of me, and I let him sand, because I thought a father's love meant making yourself easy to carry. I know better now. A father's love sometimes means refusing to be made smaller, so your child doesn't grow up to be a man who makes people small. Then he met Grace. Grace came from money, real money, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the quiet old kind, which is its own thing entirely. Her father owned half a county, and Nathan, marrying up into that world, made a decision I didn't learn the full shape of until his wedding day. He had built, for Grace's family, a version of himself with no bread truck in it, no pre-dawn deliveries, no delivery driver father in a 15-year-old suit. In the story Nathan told his fiancée's family about who he was, I did not exist. And a wedding is a dangerous place for a man who doesn't exist, because at a wedding, the two families meet. So here's what I didn't know, driving to that church. I didn't know that Nathan had told Grace's family I was dead. Not estranged, not absent, dead. He'd told them his father passed years ago, that he'd been raised by a single mother who also passed, that he was, essentially, a self-made orphan who'd clawed his way up from nothing, with no one. It was a cleaner story than a living father who drove a bread truck. And I was about to walk into a room full of people who'd been told I was in the ground. I want you to hold on to that, because it explains the whisper. When Nathan saw me come through the door of that church, invited by him, months earlier, in a weak moment he'd clearly come to regret, he wasn't just embarrassed. He was a man watching his own carefully built lie walk in on two legs. And so he came to me fast, at the door, before anyone could connect us, and he put his hand on my arm, like an usher guiding a stranger, and he whispered it. "Dad, please, pretend you don't know me, just today. Sit in the back. I'll explain everything after, please." And I looked at my son's face, and I saw that he was terrified, and God help me, my first feeling wasn't anger, it was the old reflex. My boy is scared, fix it. So I said, "All right, son." And I went and sat in the back row, in my 15-year-old suit, and I became a stranger at my only child's wedding. I want to tell you what those next 20 minutes felt like, sitting there, because I think some of you know exactly what they felt like. I watched my son get married from the back row of a church, close enough to see the sweat on his neck, far enough that he'd ask me to pretend I couldn't. I watched Grace's family fill the front rows, her father, her mother, a whole clan of people who'd been told the groom had no one. And I sat among the distant cousins and the plus ones, an old man nobody could place, clapping at the right moments, a ghost at my own son's wedding. And I made a decision, sitting there, and I need you to hear what it was, because it's not the decision you'd expect. I decided I would do it. I would honor the whisper. I would sit in the back, and I would leave quietly before the reception, and I would never make Nathan pay for this, because I loved him more than I loved my own dignity, and because that is exactly the kind of terrible bargain a parent will make. I was not going to make a scene. I had made my peace with disappearing. And I'll be honest with you about what went through my head in that back row, because it's the truth, and this whole thing is worth nothing if I'm not honest. I thought about Nathan's mother, my Carol, gone 11 years now, and I was glad, God forgive me, I was glad that she wasn't alive to see her son ask his father to pretend to be a stranger. I thought about every pre-dawn morning, the cold cab of that truck, the way my hands ached in January, and how I never once resented a minute of it because it was for him, and I did not feel bitter, sitting there. That surprised me. I felt something quieter and worse than bitter. I felt finished, like a job that was over, like a man who had delivered his last load and could now be returned, empty, to the lot. I had spent 38 years and a whole self on that boy, and I sat in the back of his wedding and understood that he'd have preferred I not come at all, and I made my peace with it, because peace was the only thing I had left to give him that he'd still accept. But I hadn't counted on grace, because here is the thing Nathan had gotten wrong, the miscalculation underneath his whole beautiful lie. He'd told Grace the same story he'd told her family. Dead father, self-made orphan. But somewhere in their engagement, in a quiet moment, Grace had gone looking, not to catch him, just because she loved him and wanted to know where he came from. And Grace, it turned out, had found a photograph, an old one, of a man and a boy on the front of a bread truck, both of them squinting into an early sun, the boy on the man's shoulders. She'd found it months before the wedding, and she'd said nothing, waiting, I think, for Nathan to trust her with the truth on his own. And now she was walking down the aisle, and halfway down she saw, in the very back row, in a 15-year-old suit, trying to be no one, the man from the photograph. I watched her stop. The music kept going for a moment, and then stumbled and quit. Her father, on her arm, tugged gently, confused. She didn't move. She was looking at me, and I was looking at my shoes, because I'd been asked to be a stranger, and I was trying so hard to be one. And then Grace let go of her father's arm. And she turned, and in front of 180 guests, and a stalled quartet, and a groom whose face was draining white at the altar, my son's bride walked back up the aisle, the wrong way, the impossible way, and came and stood in front of the old man in the back row that everyone had been told was no one. And she held out her hand to me, and she said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, loud enough for her father to hear, loud enough for Nathan to hear, "You're Earl, you're his father. I've seen your picture. Would you walk me the rest of the way?" A girl should have a father walk her toward her family, and today, you're the only father in this room who drove all night for someone. I don't fully know what she meant by that last part then. I learned later, I'll tell you. But in that moment I just knew that a young woman I had met exactly once had looked at a room built on a lie about me, and had chosen, in front of everyone she was marrying into, to tell the truth with her own 2 feet. And here is where I thought it would go. The confrontation, Nathan exposed, the lie collapsing into a scene, the wedding ruined. That's what the moment was pregnant with. That's what everyone in that church braced for. That is not what Grace did, because Grace was smarter and kinder than the moment. She didn't expose Nathan. She saved him by making the truth beautiful instead of shameful. She took my arm, and she walked me down that aisle, past her stunned family, and as we walked she said, quietly, just to me, he was going to lose me over this. I've known for months. I was waiting for him to be brave enough to tell me himself. And then, louder, at the altar, to the whole church, with her hand still on my arm, she said, Nathan didn't want anyone to know where he came from, but I want everyone to know. Because a man who was raised by a father who drove a truck before dawn for 38 years so his son could stand up here in a suit, that's not something to hide. That's the best thing about him. It's the reason I said yes. and I watched my son break. Not with shame this time, with the other thing. He came down off that altar step in front of everyone, and he put his arms around me, the bread truck father he'd asked to disappear 20 minutes earlier, and he said into my shoulder, so only I could hear, the same word he'd whispered at the door, but meaning its exact opposite now. Please, please forgive me, Dad. Real life doesn't wrap up like a movie, so let me give you the honest after. It wasn't instantly healed. A lie that big leaves a mark, and there were hard conversations in the months that followed. Nathan and I had to learn how to be father and son without the shame sitting between us, and that took time, and it wasn't always pretty. Grace's family absorbed the truth better than Nathan feared. Her father, it turned out, had started with nothing himself, and had more respect for a bread truck man than for the orphan genius myth Nathan had sold them. Turns out the lie was never even necessary. It rarely is. Shame builds walls to keep out people who'd have walked right in. And that thing Grace said, the only father in this room who drove all night for someone? I learned what she meant. Grace's own father, for all his money, had been a distant man who'd sent her to boarding schools and checks, and never once, she told me, driven through the night for her. She'd grown up wealthy and fatherless in the ways that count, and when she found that photograph of a man with his boy on his shoulders on a bread truck, she hadn't seen something to be ashamed of. She'd seen the exact thing she'd always wanted. My son had been hiding the one thing his bride most admired. Nathan and I are all right now, better than all right. He brings his friends around, real ones now, the kind who don't need him to have a cleaner father. He tells the bread truck stories himself these days, at dinner parties, proudly, and I sit there a little embarrassed by the fuss, which is its own kind of full circle. And Grace calls me every Sunday. Not Nathan, Grace. She says a girl who grew up without a father showing up has some catching up to do, and I am glad, at 71, to be caught up with. There was one evening, about a year after the wedding, that I hold on to. Nathan came by the old house, alone, unannounced, the way he used to before he got ashamed of it, and he sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework under a bare bulb, and he was quiet for a long while. And then he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say all of it." And he told me about the years of getting smaller. He'd seen it happen too, from the inside. He'd known he was doing it, and hated himself for it, and couldn't stop, because the shame had its own momentum. He told me he'd stood on a sidewalk once, the same restaurant, I realized, the same night, and thought he'd seen me through the window, and had been relieved when I didn't come in, and had cried in his car afterward out of relief, and hated the relief. We'd both been on that sidewalk. Neither of us had ever known. And we sat at that kitchen table, two grown men, and we cried about a bread truck, and it was, I think, the finest hour I've had since Carol died. The 15-year-old suit, by the way, I kept. Nathan offered to buy me 10 new ones. I wore the old one to their first child's christening on purpose, and Nathan laughed when he saw it, and understood, and didn't say a word. So here's what I'll leave the older ones with tonight, because this one is for us. The ones our children have started to find a little embarrassing. The ones being dressed in nicer jackets and corrected at dinner and quietly seated in the back. Do not disappear to make it easier for them. I almost did. I sat in that back row ready to erase myself out of love, and love was exactly the wrong reason to do it. Your children's shame is not your burden to carry by vanishing. Sit up, stay visible, be exactly who you are, in your old suit, at the wedding you paid for, in 1,000 pre-dawn deliveries they'll never fully understand. Because the people worth having, the graces of this world, they're not looking for the polished version. They're looking for the man who drove all night, and they will find him in the back row, and they will walk the wrong way down the aisle to reach him, if you only have the courage not to hide. I almost hid. I'm so glad she found me before I could. Now, the comments, and I read every one. Was I wrong to agree to the whisper? Should I have refused to pretend from the very start? Some of you will say a father should never dishonor himself that way, not even for a son. Some of you will say I did what love does, and that grace redeemed it. Tell me, and the harder question, the one I still turn over, if Grace hadn't found that photograph, if she'd never turned around, would Nathan have ever told the truth on his own? Or would I have simply disappeared, quietly, forever, and called it love? I think I know my answer. I'm afraid of it. I want to hear yours. And if you believe that the quiet ones, the ones who'd rather vanish than embarrass the people they love, and who deserve so much better than that, are the strongest people in any room, then stay with me. Because next time I'll tell you about the son who sold my late wife's piano while I was in the hospital, and the phone call I got 3 days later from the man who bought it. Take care of each other. Don't disappear for anyone. And wear the old suit.